We are live again with another episode of My Counselor Live. I'm hanging out today with Tish Hedger. We're answering your questions. My Counselor Live is a live event that we do at MyCounselor.Online, where we answer questions that you submitted throughout the week via our form on our website, or you can text it into us at Love My Counselor, or you can message through Facebook at Love My Counselor, or you can put down in the comments here in this section any questions that you have. We'll field the questions, kick them back and forth between us, and give you a Christian counselor's perspective on whatever the issue is that you have a question around. So it's your opportunity to get some feedback. If you've ever had a wondering about something that you wonder what a professional counselor would say in regards to that situation, or a real current situation that you're facing and dealing with that you'd like some feedback and direction on, we're here to answer your questions. Be happy to do that. I'm Josh Spurlock. I'm the founder of MyCounselor.Online. Tish Hedger is a clinician and our interim clinical director at MyCounselor.Online. MyCounselor.Online is a Christian counseling practice that specializes in providing counseling services via the internet and through Zoom therapy sessions, the HIPAA compliant telehealth portal. And so if you've got further questions about connecting with a Christian counselor, would like to connect with somebody via that, you can visit our website, MyCounselor.Online, find out all the details. But yeah, thanks for joining me again, Tish.
Yeah, it's so good to be here. I had so much fun last week.
It was a lot of fun. Enjoyed hanging out with you always. And it's fun to be able to see people's questions and have a chance to be able to interact and dialogue around those. And so we're going to jump right into that now. We've got some questions that have been sent in since our meeting last week. And this first one that we want to take a look at is from a gal who's struggled with a binge eating disorder and was compulsive shopping, which the stress of the present crises going on hasn't helped either of those things for her. She recognizes that there are poor coping mechanisms for grief and stress in her life. She's tried a few different things to try to address that. Hasn't had a whole lot of success with that, and is just really wondering, how do we navigate unhealthy coping mechanisms? How do we understand the things that we do in order to manage the internal conflict, stress, and emotions that we're experiencing? That we call coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms. So it's a great question. It's relevant really to every one of us. It doesn't really matter what your defense mechanism or method of coping is. None of us are without coping mechanisms. And there's the list of different things that can be defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms is huge. Some of them are blaring and obvious, whether that be a substance abuse or addiction, and that we use to escape things, or things that can be really socially acceptable and really socially reinforced. You know, one of the coping mechanisms that I've gone to over the years and have to be mindful of is workaholism. That I love the work that I do, feel good and confident in that domain of my life. And so it's easy for me to lose myself and distract myself from other things that are going on with me by pouring more energy and time and effort into that. And that's a really socially reinforced coping mechanism and defense mechanism. You know, the idea of a good work ethic and putting in the hustle and the effort in your job is on the surface of it is a good thing. It's not bad. Certainly employers appreciate that and enjoy that. And so it can be a very positive and good thing, but the role that it can sometimes play in my life is one of a defense mechanism, and it becomes an unhealthy thing. So whether it be something like this gal is identifying that she sees as clearly being destructive in her life, and as a coping mechanism, or something that maybe you haven't even considered is a coping mechanism or haven't even considered is a kind of defense that you use. All of us have these things. So would love to hear from you, Tish, just a little bit as you're conceptualizing and thinking about defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms. How do you explain to clients what that is and what exactly that means?
Yes, a defense mechanism is anything that we use to help us escape emotion, help us to numb, help us to avoid kind of the deeper experience internally that we're having that is behind the stress. So I would say even stress is this very, kind of general term that's all encompassing. And so what we would be trying to avoid would be like the very specific components of why we're stressed and why.
Can you talk about that for just a minute? That those terms are things that a lot of times get used interchangeably, right? That, stress, anxiety, I'm feeling stress, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling angst, or that I have symptoms or struggles because of the stress that I'm experiencing. Can you maybe break that down a little bit in terms of how we as clinicians think about stress and anxiety?
Absolutely. Stress is a physiological event in our bodies. And so we know we're stressed because our body is physiologically having a stress response that involves the internal systems of our body and the response that our systems are having, the kind of chemicals that it's pumping out into our bloodstream. So stress is certainly not this like thing of our imagination. It is very embodied, something that we're experiencing. And that same is true for anxiety. And so we would see anxiety being the body's kind of alarm system, that it's going off saying, danger, danger, I'm not okay. There is a threat that I'm perceiving. And we would say that stress is the alarm system hasn't reached the fever pitch of anxiety. And, but the same is true about stress. When our body when stress is accumulating inside of our body and that's showing up in different ways, physically and mentally, we feel fatigued, we have digestion disruption, we have headaches, whatever our symptoms we're not sleeping as well, whatever the symptoms might be, that's our body saying, hey, I'm not okay, I need some care.
It's really that adrenal response in the body.
Yeah.
Right? The brain is triggering the adrenal glands, which are little kidney bean shaped blobs of tissue that actually hang out on either side of your kidneys. You got two of them. And as the brain sends a message, and it gets on the phone, calls down to the adrenals and says, hey, crank out some anxiety and give us, 2 units, 3 minutes, give us this much of it. And the adrenal glands release that cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine kind of into our bloodstream. And this whole flood of physiological responses start happening, right?
Yes.
Super important. Like we need adrenal response. Like it's necessary for survival. We need it in small doses that kind of prompt us to be productive human beings, and feel a little bit of angst about getting fired. And so we decide to show up to work on time. That's a valuable little bit of angst that motivates us to get moving. We need a flood of it when we're in an accident or being attacked by a bear, and we've got to run for our life, and we've got to age. And so that adrenaline in our muscles that causes us to shake and twitch and causes capillaries in our bloodstream to constrict so that blood pressure goes up and can push out all the different things that our body needs when it's in a fight or an action or in flight. The heightened senses, the focus of our senses, kind of blocking out pain and other things to hyper focus. All these things are incredibly important and necessary. Nobody could survive if we were completely anxiety free, stress free. Kind of having your adrenals cut out would be bad news for you. So what is it that really like makes it a bad thing? Like when I think about anxiety, when
Yeah.
clients think about anxiety, like it's never used in a positive sense. You're like, oh, God, I've got an anxiety response in my body. Thank God for that. It's always in a negative sense. So what is it that causes it to be a bad thing?
Yeah. You know, I love how you're describing that stress response, that danger response, how important it is. And I want to mention that, and that our body doesn't differentiate the difference between a physical imminent danger and a relational danger. That relational distress can feel inside of our body as life threatening as a physical imminent danger kind of situation. And so
Using the neuroscience around that, right? And as we're kind of watching brain scans and seeing those things, that's not just a something that counselors say.
Right.
It's something that counselors have known for a long time, and really people have known for a long time, the kind of fear and despair and pain and anxiety that can happen in relational distresses. But the neuroscience that really shows the brain imagery and what's happening, is just reinforcing the reality of that so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when we think about anxiety, I want to differentiate some categories of our emotions and how, if we use the word anxiety is certainly an emotion. But we would consider it to be a inhibitory emotion, an emotion that that we use internally, not consciously, but that our body kind of employs to block other core emotion. So when I say core emotion, I'm talking about the kind of categories that all emotions could be pretty narrowed down to. So those would be emotions like fear, anger, sadness, disgust. There's also some good feeling ones like joy and excitement. And a lot of times, whenever there's not enough space for us to kind of process and unpack what's happening on that kind of categorical level of emotion, or we're in a situation where we aren't resourced to be able to process that, we don't have the relational resources, which happens a lot in childhood because children can't get in a car and go find other relationship support if it's not present for them. And so that's when when our body produces anxiety, and it's helping block that, and it's being very useful saying danger, danger, we're not okay, we need to either fight or we need to run away or we need to freeze, to kind of have these like survival responses. And when we are in a stressed, like an anxious space inside, our brains become very rigid. And so our thinking mind, our frontal cortex, is not behaving with the rest of the brain as it normally does when we're not under duress. And so our brain kind of lacks the ability to be as flexible. It's not able to discriminate. The part of the brain, the hippocampus, who does discriminate, when our brain is stressed, it ceases to do that and it generalizes. And so, maybe I'm getting ahead of us, but that creates the very real need for defenses.
Yeah, before we go into defenses and what they're in, it might be helpful even just to back up a little bit and just thinking about what emotion is, right?
Yeah.
I know, man, it maybe we all talk about our feelings, we all talk about emotions,
Yeah.
but it really isn't clear to most folks kind of what exactly an emotion is. That I know for the longest time, I always thought of emotions as kind of these ethereal, like they float in the air.
They're gonna get you.
Right. They're like some sort of metaphysical type force in the universe that are a mystery, and they come upon you at the most inconvenient times and get me into trouble. and I don't like them. I don't want them. They just feel like
Yeah.
more of a nuisance. My emotions, other people's emotions feel like a nuisance, and I don't really understand them anyways. And so, I think it could be helpful just to spend a couple of minutes saying, why do we need emotions? Do we have a choice in the matter? Can we like opt out of them? I'd like to opt out of having emotions, if please. I've had my share of those. I'm done experiencing emotion and being emotional, right? And what emotion and who needs them anyways?
Yeah, what a great question. And I think that the easiest way, how I describe it with my clients and how I think about it inside myself, is that emotions are, we're all wired with core emotion. And so across culture, it is very consistent that everyone experiences fear, anger, sadness, disgust, joy, and excitement. And that we are wired with these emotions that give us authentic information about how we are experiencing the world around us. And so it is literally how we can know how we are experiencing relationships and events and the world. So for example, anger is when we have an angry response, experience anger is really important. For example, it's telling us that something is wrong, right? And in a world that's out of tune with how God designed it, created it to be, we wouldn't be able to identify what's unjust. We wouldn't be able to identify, we would be handicapped in identifying, experiencing what is right or wrong. Disgust says, move away, get away, move away from that. And so every,
I was just saying, it's so, I think, important what you just said there around anger. Anger seems to be one of the emotions that we're most uncomfortable with, right? That a lot of times when we think of anger, we think of something destructive, and we think of something damaging. We think of how ugly anger can be expressed at times in a way that really tears people down, destroys relationships, creates so much hate and ugliness in the world that we kind of think of anger as being something that should just be eliminated altogether. But what I hear you saying and what we recognize as professional counselors is that anger is actually part of the way God made us, and it's a reflection of the Imago Dei, or the image of God in us. That God experiences anger, and as people created in his image and likeness, we experience anger also. And we should get angry about the things that God gets angry about. That the character and nature of God compels us, if we're going to be congruent and reflective of that, that when we see injustice in the world, when we see the kind of the weak being taken advantage of, or we see the vulnerable not being protected or looked out for, or we see what's right being violated in some way, that we should feel a sense of that injustice and feel angry about that. That anger actually energizes us and mobilizes us to do something about that injustice. Whether that's involving somebody else in an injustice that we're witnessing, or even an injustice that we're experiencing. That we can be in, say, a relationship context where it's abusive, the dynamics of that. And it is right for us to go, hey, this isn't okay. It's not okay to be demeaning and destructive towards me. And I'm going to mobilize, because I've been energized by this anger and recognizing the rightness of that anger, and assert boundaries. I'm going to use my no to say, no, I'm not okay with this. I'm not going to go along with this. I'm not going to allow you to be abusive in this relationship. I can't control you, but I can control me. And it can really mobilize really helpful and necessary action, either on behalf of the self or on behalf of others. And so anger gets a bad rap, I think.
It does. And, even as you're sharing this, in my mind are the questions that I hear so often in sessions from my clients about anger, because they have experienced anger within themselves or in others that has felt destructive and has felt like it's hurt relationships or it's been harmful in some way to them or to others. And so, in our conversation about emotion, it's so good to distinguish. We have these core emotions, and then we have inhibitory emotions, which anxiety is one that's meant to block core emotions. And then we have secondary emotions, emotions that layer. So for example, jealousy is a secondary emotion that it is the core emotion underneath it, more vulnerably at the root, is fear, right? And so anger can also be a secondary emotion. And a lot of times when we have seen anger within ourselves, that didn't feel, we felt convicted, like, oh, I didn't handle that right, or we've experienced someone else's anger in a way that was very hurtful. Oftentimes what we're experiencing is secondary anger, and that core emotion is the more vulnerable emotions underneath the anger. And so I think that that's an important distinguisher to make. In fact, anger can even be a defense. Rage can be a defense.
Totally. Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I want to kind of run with this more and kind of think about, as we're looking at defenses and thinking about defenses, maybe use anger as a case example of that. Because I know with a lot of clients I work with, oftentimes they've gotten the message growing up or in different settings that it's unchristian to experience anger, that it's not good or right for them to experience anger, that anger is inherently sinful, which of course is not what the scriptures communicate. God expresses anger and experiences anger, and he doesn't sin much. And James tells us to be angry and sin not. That doesn't say don't be angry because it's sinful, but in our anger not to sin. So it just differentiates within the scriptures between the emotion and experience of anger versus sinful action that can flow out of that. So it'd be good for us to spend a little bit more time kind of fleshing that out and understanding that anger, along with all of our other emotions, are really part of an information dashboard that God has wired into our body. That dashboard provides information to us about what's happening inside of us, what's happening around us, and really our relationship to what's happening around us, which is a really key distinction or thing to understand about emotion, is that it's telling us something about how we relate to something that we're experiencing in our life or going on around us. That's why, 5 people can have 5 different responses to the same event. Right?
If you're married, you have experienced this.
For sure, right? Yes. So our emotional response may be very different than the next person or our spouse that experienced the same set of circumstances, the same facts, but experience them very differently because our relationship to that set of facts or that situation is different. And so our emotional response to it is going to be different. And the dashboard lights that come on are really just indicating that there's information to be looked into. A lot of the guides that I work with can relate to this and understand the dashboard analogy. Because if the dashboard light comes on in your truck, you don't want to jerk the wires loose from under the dash because the light's annoying, right? That's going to lead to something very bad happening, because that dashboard light's alerting you to information that you need to know. If you put a piece of tape over it to block it out because you don't want to see it, then you're cutting yourself off from that information. The healthy and appropriate response to seeing a dashboard light come on in your truck, so pull the truck over and look into, what does this indicator mean? It may mean plugging in a device that reads the code. It may mean pulling the user's manual out and open it up and going, oh, this means that my engine is overheating. This probably a good idea to turn it off and put it in park here, because if I go on much longer like this, I'm going to blow up the motor and it's going to be a mess, huge loss that takes place. I don't want to ignore that. I want to listen to it. but it also doesn't end there, right? Just knowing what the dashboard light means
Right.
isn't like the end goal of the dashboard light. Like the dashboard light is alerting me to something that's going on under the hood, but it's also informing me about action that needs to be taken, whether that's turning off the vehicle, calling a tow truck, whether that's alerting me to parts that need to be changed out, maintenance that needs to be done. You know, there's an action tendency that's a part of that dashboard light. And so it's bringing information to me that doesn't control what it is I do, but it
Right.
definitely informs me about what it is I do. So if I cut myself off from that emotional
Yes.
experience, if I cut myself off from that dashboard, I'm flying blind in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That there's some information that God has wired into me because it's valuable and important, and He wanted me to have access to that. And if I cut myself off from that, I'm really doing myself a disservice because I'm trying to navigate life without significant information that the Lord has wanted to make available to me. And so I think it's a key thing that we want to tune into and recognize that maybe some of the myths that we've heard around emotion, and would love for those maybe that are listening or that are just joining and kind of coming in and joining the discussion. If you've heard some myths around or things that you wonder if it's a myth or not around emotion, be cool to comment about those, message those in, and we can kind of respond to and talk through, you know, Mythbuster or fact or fiction around some of the thoughts around emotion. But I want to get back to the question that we've got here on, you know, what are these coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms, and how do they relate to this discussion? Maybe specifically around anger.
Yes. So defenses can be internal, it can be external, and it can also be relational or like in your relationships. And so, like, for example, with anger, a defensive anger is where you are experiencing, and it isn't like something that we're choosing, right? It's not something that we are like making this decision of like, oh,
They're well thought out. And you're like, you know what? I think I'm going to be defensive today. And which defensive strategy do I want to use?
Right.
You consider
My husband loves it when I'm defensive, or he prefers this defensive strategy. So, right. Yes.
The variety is wonderful. We don't want to keep it mixed up. We don't want to get bored with our defenses.
Right. And so it's so important because I think the question, she feels really bewildered by why she can't stop it. And it feels very impulsive. It feels very, there's a lot of feelings of helplessness. Whenever we identify a defense, certainly defenses that tend to have just more easy shame around them, such as addiction, or such as an eating disorder, or such as overspending or binge eating. And so to understand that sense of lack of control is very real and very true, that it isn't that in the moment you are making a conscious decision to cope that way. There is even I would say even a point of no return, especially with the more addictive defenses, where the battle's not going to happen in that moment when you are so overcome and your body is so under duress and your brain is so rigid and everything is shut down, but either like fight, flight, or freeze. And your body's like, we need the nearest escape button because this stress is going to harm us if we don't find a way to downregulate it.
Oh, that's so helpful and so important, because oftentimes, you know, there's this thought that, okay, give me the technique or the strategy or that thing that I can do in that moment where I'm, you know, binging, or rather I'm struggling with, you know, whatever it is, the mechanism that I use to cope. You know, we really want like a magic phrase that we can say, or click our heels together, or a pill that we can take in that moment. You know, something that at that moment where we feel like we're losing control, we're out of our mind, that are going to completely change things. But what I hear you saying is that oftentimes there's a place of almost inevitability where we don't have the resources mentally or emotionally to kind of change course in that moment.
Right.
Which I think, if we step back from it, I think most of us can identify with. I know I've definitely found myself in those places where, even when I know what I'm doing or what I'm saying isn't helpful, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Like I can't, I know this is a terrible idea, but I can't seem to stop myself. Like I just need to put my hand over my mouth and stop, but I just can't seem to do that.
Yeah.
What I hear you saying is that really, if we're going to change these things or have them be different, that battle's won or lost before we're in the middle of that situation. It's not like we're going to whip out a technique in the middle of that and have the state of mind and the ability or the mental or emotional resources can change the momentum and a direction of that on a dime. That it's really the things that we engage prior to being in those moments that then make it possible for us to redirect or steer. Is that right?
Oh, so much so. The before and kind of what we're doing with our emotion, how we're noticing our anxiety and our stress before, and then also how we think about what happened is very important, because oftentimes how we think about what happened is perpetuating the need for the defense. So I binge, I purge, and then I feel tremendous shame. I have scary core emotions like fear. I feel helpless. Oh my gosh, what does this mean? And there's sadness, that's a part of deeper things going on in my life. And all of that's way too overwhelming, right? So I can't stay in that space of those core emotions and that experience of how I'm experiencing and relating to myself in the world. So I'm all up in shame and anxiety. Shame is another really toxic, really powerful inhibitory emotion. So then I am having this shame or anxious reaction as I think about that defense. And so then what is it doing? It is skyrocketing our stress. It is only like fuel on the fire to what's happening inside of our body.
That cycle, right? Like if our defenses are about getting away from that anxiety, getting away from that shame, then it seems like it drives us right back to our defenses.
Yeah, it sure does, right? Because this whole process, we're talking about emotions, but a lot of times what all of us, because of our culture and because there was no emotional 101 class in elementary school or high school or college or graduate or anywhere.
You didn't have like an emotional 101 class as part of your, formal education? Wasn't covered in Sunday school? No,
even though it's like this universal, right? And so because of that, we often are we are experiencing the cognitions, we're experiencing the thoughts. And that's a lot of times what we're conscious of. We're conscious of our behavior, and we are experiencing the shameful thoughts or the anxious thoughts and ruminations that this emotional experience is creating. And I think it's so important for us to tune into this process that's happening inside of ourselves, where the defense is telling a story, a really important story about the pain that you're in and what you're experiencing. And in the same way, it's like, so the defense is really like a big flashing light. There's a wound in you. There's something that you're bleeding out, and our body's trying to do the best it can to stop the hemorrhaging. And then the shame or the anxiety is telling a story about some deeper emotion that really needs tending to. But to do that, we have to have curiosity and empathy towards ourselves, which can be very, very challenging. Be challenging. I relate to that. I experience that as challenging.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, much more natural for me is that internal judge or critic, right? That wants to be like, what's wrong with you? What were you thinking? You blew it. And
Yes.
That's much more natural kind of voice for me
Mm.
to go to rather than one of compassion and curiosity
Yes.
about those things. Like for the person who kind of finds himself in that place, right, where they've been
Yeah.
in their defenses, they have shown up in a way that they know isn't helpful, isn't how they want to
Mm.
handle the situation, and they're feeling that guilt, they're feeling that shame, maybe even disgust kind of with themselves and the
Mhm.
way they handle the
Mhm.
situation. How can they kind of break out of that so they don't end up in a shame spiral that just gets them
Mm.
right back into that cycle?
Yeah. Well, I want to say something because as you're describing this, I think that I'm struck with even in my own life how painful this is,
Mm,
right? That we're talking about it very like on a like cognitive level, but even as we're talking, like I'm beginning to connect inside myself of like, this is hard.
mm,
Like this is the hard stuff of life. Like these are the places where we are afraid. These are the places where insecurities and kind of faulty messages about our worth have been with us for our whole lives. And I mean, these are very powerful processes inside of us. And so I think I first just want to say that God didn't create us, He didn't create us to be able to ground ourselves in all of our pain, in all of our emotions by ourselves. And so I think my first word of advice would be one of the greatest antidotes for shame is I would say the greatest antidote for shame is connection.
mm.
And the greatest resource we have to calm and soothe our nervous system when it's strung out on anxiety is connection.
Yeah, and yet it's the thing that we tend to like really run from, right? Like
Right.
we get in this place, I think I go back to like the Garden of Eden, right? And we're
Mm-hmm.
hearing the story of the fall of man and what's happening. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that takes place is that we hide, right?
Yes.
The one that we need the most to run to that
Mm-hmm.
space, we find ourselves in fear and hiding from. And man, that
Mm-hmm.
tendency just continues on. And I really think
Mm-hmm.
it's a strategy that the enemy uses to keep
Mm-hmm.
us in a weak and wounded place.
I agree.
First Peter says that our enemy is like a roaring lion, kind of roaming about looking for whom he can consume. I don't know if you've ever watched like PBS or Discovery Channel, like Lion Week, right?
I barely can handle it. I'm like, in heaven, the lion is going to lay with the lamb, and I can't wait.
But you check that out and watch kind of lions hunting, and that there's this interesting dynamic that sheds some light for me on that passage, because you'll notice that lions don't go for the zebra in the middle of the pack.
Right.
Like they'll get trampled to death by the other zebras. Like they're looking for the zebra that's over here with his head in the grass to kind of surround, and it
Yes.
doesn't go well for that zebra. And that
Yes.
like is not good.
No.
Yeah,
Right.
but I think that the enemy really works like
Yeah.
that, right? That
He
he
does.
works to isolate us from the
Yes.
body and isolate us from connection
Yes.
and relationship in a way that makes
Yes.
us weak and makes us vulnerable, and where he can just
Yes.
tear us apart. And I just see that
Yes.
with so many folks.
Yes, I do too, Josh. And to the person that, maybe you're relating and you're identifying your own defenses and maybe your own shame, I would say the most powerful thing you can do is reach out to a safe person and tell them, you
Mhm.
know, hey, I struggle with this and I'm not sure my next steps, but I just need you to know that. And there's something about these are people that there's trust built. These are people that are safe, but reaching out to them and allowing ourselves to experience their acceptance honestly is a big antibiotic, a big dose of antibiotics for the pain that we're experiencing that can interrupt that cycle and help us escape from that vicious cycle of shame and anxiety to trying to cope with the shame and anxiety with defense. The defense is creating more shame and anxiety. And so we're trying to tolerate that. Eventually we can't, and we need the defense more of having someone in that space with us, that I accept you. And really all of our emotions need to be metabolized in the context of relationship.
We call that co-regulating, right?
Yes.
That's our fancy clinical counselor term from that God wired us to co-regulate. That's the way our neurology is built. And you see that in the scriptures where it talks about us bearing one another's burdens and grieving with those that grieve and rejoicing with those in the rejoicing. And that's not just like a nice thing to do, right? It's like, let's bear one another's burdens because that's a nice thing to do. It's actually for the physiology of how God made us, that the research, the secular kind of neuroscience research about how human beings operate and interact communicates and highlights and underscores that necessity that we have to navigate through especially traumatic and difficult experiences like in the context of relationship with other human beings. That connecting around those things is how we metabolize those in a way that is healthy and really makes the difference between a really significant bad thing that happens in our life kind of healing and becoming part of our story and our history, or it's becoming traumatic, ever-present part of our present. And that's made or broken really in whether or not we're able to metabolize that in the context of healthy co-regulation, healthy relationships within our life. So I hear you saying, Tish, that as we think about the coping mechanisms and the defense mechanisms, and how do I change that, that there's the antidote, or a significant part of the antidote is to develop the ability in the relationships to be able to engage and process the underlying core emotion and the angst in those relationships, as opposed to being isolated with it in a way that drives us to those defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely. I've heard it said that we were created to tolerate a lot, but we are not wired to tolerate loneliness. That loneliness in and of itself is actually traumatic because of how God created us. The sense of God created us for connection with himself, but he also wired us for us to experience the manifestation of connection in relationships with others, and that there's a sustenance to that and a resource that we aren't created to hold our pain on our own. And God actually didn't create us for us only ever to hold our pain with him. He created us to hold our pain with others as he's holding us, as we're clinging to him, that it isn't like an either or, but it is definitely we definitely need Christ, and we definitely need others.
Yes, I'm so glad that you said that, because I think that's one of the big, myths, distortions of the scriptures, tools that the enemy uses to keep folks isolated, and that somehow our relationship with God, our relationship with Christ, is intended to be this kind of metaphysical relationship where it's just me and Jesus in my prayer closet, and I don't need anybody, and I don't need people. And as a person that felt really wounded by some relationships in my life growing up, that I really embraced that ideology, because it fit with my defenses, right? That people were scary, people weren't trustworthy, being vulnerable in relationship was not something I was interested in. And so a kind of spirituality that I could practice in isolation, just kind of me, my Bible, and Jesus in my prayer closet, felt a lot safer to me than engaging with people. But as I'm studying my Bible, I recognize that the body of Christ that I'm to have a relationship with isn't just a metaphysical thing. And this isn't where we've escaped Gnostic heresies, where Christ isn't physical in that, but that Christ is incarnational and that he came in a physical body. And even though he's ascended, that we are his body. And that relating to Christ means also relating to his people, which are his body and the manifestation of his body, you know, in the present age and season. And so it's impossible to have a healthy spirituality that's lived out in isolation from the body, from other people and human interactions. We're just made for that. It's part of how God designed the world to operate. And so that it's completely understandable. I personally identify with kind of that sentiment of people are scary. I can't trust people. I don't want to be vulnerable with people. And so I'm just me and Jesus are going to do our thing because he's perfect. He's not going to fail me. And so I can, you know, be safe in that relationship. But it just doesn't work. We're not wired that way. And we can't navigate life in a healthy way like that.
Yes. And I'm so relating to what you're saying. You know, I think in my own life, our past wounds wire us in a sense of, you know, as we're growing up, we're asking ourselves, what can we know about ourselves? What can we know and expect from others? And is the world safe? And our childhood and how we're treated in childhood answers those questions. And then the answers become wired into our identity. And then we carry that into our adulthood, and we learn other things about the truth of God and how, you know, we're loved and how he's called us to relationships, right? And we hold that. But it's whenever our fear or our shame, or we're in these, I would say, like the tight, scary spots of life, that's when when we're afraid, we're going to respond how we responded in our childhood. What was available to us? What was the protocol? And so if God created you know, we've all been around babies. If God created our emotional pain to be held by another, right? Babies know they have worth or they wouldn't cry. Babies cry because they have an innate wired inside of them sense that I cry when I need something because I think someone's going to come.
Yes.
Because my needs matter. And as there's that response and that acceptance and that empathy and someone caring for them, then that is wiring in them a sense of I'm good, right? I'm worthy of love, to give and receive love. And when I call out in the night, someone's there.
Yes.
And that actually is our sense of safety in the world. And so, you know, as we talk about defenses, it is really just the tertiary symptom of what's going on inside of us, and that we all are humans raised by humans and, you know, have a lot to overcome. My children will too. You know, I'm like, we'll pay for your therapy.
We got a college fund, we got a therapy fund. Yeah.
Yes. And, you know, but I think of being aware of these processes inside of yourself. So notice what happens inside of me when I have in my mind, I know this person loves me and I know I love them. Why can I not feel connected with them? Why am I holding back vulnerability in my heart? And even the first step is even being aware that you are. And the second step is being curious about why. And that truly, as you know, kind of embark on awareness and exploration and curiosity, I would say that that's very much the sanctification and the healing that the Holy Spirit is very like ready and willing and already to do and already has in progress in our lives. But us to intentionally engage in that is really, I mean, just the awareness of what's happening inside of you. So then you can ask the question why, and then go look for the answer.
Right. You know, one of a question that we've got in response to this discussion that we've been having that I think is one that a lot of people have and is totally relevant. It's you know, what about the reality that not everybody's safe to be vulnerable with? And when you have people in your life, maybe you're you're hearing this and you're going, okay, so the antidote, we're wired for connection and created for connection, and God desires for us to bear one another's burdens with each other, and to look to and reach out to others to join with us and hold those things with us and help us process through that in community. But what if the people in your life aren't really healthy? What if you try to be vulnerable with it and it gets turned back around on you in a way that feels shaming, or it feels demeaning or destructive, or feels critical, or that you can't share without triggering their defenses, and they seem to show up in a way that's doesn't feel good. What do you do with those kinds of relationships?
It's hard. That is such a good question. Yes.
Yeah. So, I think we should spend a little bit of time talking around that, because that's a universal struggle that we have. None of us, because we live in a sinful, broken world, are completely surrounded by perfectly healthy people who always respond well.
The people that are around me.
Right.
That experience, right.
Yeah, and the people who experience me don't always experience me as being healthy and mature the way I show up.
Yes.
With, right?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so there's this kind of a few different thoughts that are here, right? One is, how do I tell the difference between healthy and unhealthy? How long do I kind of strive in relationship with folks who aren't healthy, aren't safe to engage? Am I under obligation to strive with that relationship indefinitely? And what if they're a close friend, or what if they're a family member, or someone I go to church to? Do I just continue to put my vulnerable heart out there in a way where it gets beat up and dumped on? Or how do I navigate that? And so maybe let's just take that in a few different pieces, and maybe start with how do we notice or tell the difference between safe people and not safe people? Like, how do we recognize kind of what that looks like in our experience? What do you say to that, Tish?
Yeah, two things come to mind, kind of, just off the top of my head. And one is, if they can hear, this hurt me. This happened between us, and this is how I experienced it, and it hurt me. And I would say how a person can be in that space with you is a big indicator. Just it isn't an indicator if they're a good or bad person. It's just an indicator of their maturity and where they are in their own journey of being able to hold their own emotions and their own reactions to show up to that space in a way that can make room for your pain, or make room for your experience that is different than their own.
Can you compare and contrast maybe two different responses to that?
Yes.
What is that? What's a healthy response to that look like? If I come to you in relationship, or if I come to someone in my life in relationship and I say, how this went down, either what you said or what I experienced or what I understood to be meant, something about this situation really felt hurtful. Didn't feel good to me. I don't like the way that felt, and I care about our relationship. I want to bring this to you and share this with you. Kind of compare, what would be kind of a healthy response to that, and then maybe what a unhealthy response would be.
I would say that as a person who is kind of what you would experience from a person who is healthy, one is that they would care. And maybe that's too simplistic, but that would stop them in their tracks. And, maybe say, tell me more, or, that's so hard to hear. I hate that you felt that way.
Is that like, I'm sorry you feel that way? Then?
Right. No, that isn't, I'm sorry you feel that way. No. But I mean, but those same words could be used in, I am so sorry that you feel that way. Like, as you tell me this, I just, and so that they have a caring response that that is accepting that your experience is valid.
And what you're experiencing matters to me.
Yes.
I care about how you are impacted. I may not agree with you about what should happen or shouldn't happen here. I may not believe what it is I said or did was wrong or not wrong, but irregardless of whether I agree with you or see it the same way as you, what you experience matters to me. And I care about how the situation has impacted to me because I care about you. You matter to me.
Yes. So I would say that's number one of a safe person. And then the second thing that comes to mind is if they are able to take responsibility for when they do make a mistake or sin or, are just kind of miss something that was important in the relationship, of being able to kind of look within their own heart and in the context of what has happened and take responsibility for, this happens, right, in our marriages and our relationships, and of being able to say, man, I really was inside in a bad mood. I did speak impatiently with you, or that you're right, that really wasn't considerate of you, and I'm really sorry about that.
Yeah, there's it sounds like in part what you're describing is humility, right? Kind of a willingness and a humbly kind of recognize our flawedness, our imperfection, and our capacity to be sinful, our capacity to be hurtful, our capacity to have blind spots and to unintentionally be hurtful. And for in humility, when we recognize how we have showed up in a situation has impacted another, to care about that and to be willing to be reflective and be willing to, they can go, okay, what's my part in this? And even invite the Holy Spirit into that space and say, Father, help me see my part in this and help me recognize and see myself as you see me, so that I can be willing to look at those things, look in the mirror and see what needs to be addressed and changed and confront those things, as opposed to kind of push those off and being, well, that's your problem. No.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or that's not what I meant. Doesn't that erase your emotion?
Right. That's not what I meant. And so you shouldn't be hurt by it.
Right. And so doesn't that fix it? And, I think we're talking about a specific, like, what might an interaction look like with a safe person? And then I think the other aspect of this, of if trust is really being built in a relationship, this is happening. And then they also reciprocate this vulnerability. And so that's something that when you step back from a relationship and assess what level of trust have we built in this relationship, is that's something reciprocal and mutual happening in the relationship. And that's coming from someone who, when I look at myself in my life when I was younger, I think that I did the part of receiving well, but I didn't do the part of sharing vulnerably well in relationships. Therefore, I was lacking in trustworthiness, not because I didn't care about them, not because I didn't love them, but because of my own stuff of being held back from participating in that dynamic in the relationship. I became a person that shouldn't be in their most inner circle. So.
Yeah. So if we carry that then forward a little bit, and we use that criteria, kind of use that way of evaluating relationship, and we come to the conclusion that a person in our life that maybe we have been looking to bear those things with us, or that we've considered or have invited into that circle with us to do life in that way, but they just aren't safe. They're just not at a place of maturity. They consistently show up in ways that are not helpful and don't facilitate healing and wholeness, engagement, but instead are intentionally or unintentionally destructive, within the relationship. What do you do? And what do you do with that relationship? Like, is it okay to change that relationship? And if so, how do you go about doing that?
Oh, it's so hard. This is like so, I just am connecting with how painful it is to be in this situation, and that it brings so much grief and so much sadness. And we really need safe people to be able to process when we're in this type of situation, because it's
Totally.
very complicated inside of
Totally.
ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of drop some breadcrumbs along the way because there's multiple pieces for
Mm,
that. I think it's really
mhm,
helpful to recognize that sometimes, we have folks
mhm,
that really are surrounded by people that are broken and unhealthy,
mm,
and
yeah.
that they literally don't have a single person in their life that's not
Mhm.
uh, that doesn't meet that unhealthy, unsafe criteria.
Right.
That and while some people may kind of shrug that off and go, well, is that really true? And I'm thankful that if that's what you're thinking at this moment, that you've kind of grown up with enough safe people in your life that it's hard for you
Mm,
to imagine kind of existing in
yes.
the world. But there are lots of people that are born into families that have generational dysfunction, and
Mm,
everybody that they parents ever brought them around, or that they were ever around, that had really distorted and broken understandings of
mm,
the world. And so they all
mhm,
their family and family friends and people that they've had exposure to are just not been healthy people. So all the people in their life
mhm,
are really
mhm,
unhealthy,
mhm,
immature, kind of broken individuals. And if you have been normed to
mhm,
that, that is normal is kind of what you're used to. Let's say
mhm,
normal is a setting on a washing machine, right? That normal is
mhm.
whatever is normal to you. It's what you grew up around. It's
Yeah,
what feels familiar and common to
yeah.
you. It may be very unhealthy, but very unhealthy might be normal to you. It might be what
Mhm,
you're used to. You might even have awareness that there's
mhm,
something outside of that in the world, right?
mhm,
There's
mhm,
some people watching this who heard Tish describe kind of what a healthy, safe response is like. And they were like, yeah, is that
mhm.
for real? Like, people actually say that sort of stuff? Like,
Mm,
there's not a single conversation I've had in my life with someone that went like that.
mm, mm, mhm,
That honestly, earnestly don't have any personal experience with that. And what I
yeah.
hear you saying, Tish, is that if you fall in that category, or even if it's not that extreme in your life, that trying to sort through
Mhm,
what's up and what's down and what's healthy and what's not healthy is incredibly confusing, because you don't have like a good standard to measure it by. You don't
mhm,
have like, this is healthy, this is good. I can see that this is not that, and so that's not good and healthy. That the whole
mhm,
world can be turned upside down. And you can grow
mhm,
up in an environment where you're taught your whole life that, black is white and white is black. And so when you
mhm.
point to the bookshelves behind me and say, that these are, white bookshelves, you go, oh, that's crazy. I know that color is black. I've been told my whole life that that color is black.
Yeah,
It's
yes.
normal for me to think that that color is black,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
because that's what you know. That's what you've been taught your whole life. And so
mhm,
sometimes there's a need to get connected with somebody
mhm,
outside of your circle. And
mhm,
sometimes that's a role, I know that you and I play, and other professional counselors play in a person's life. That sometimes
mhm,
there's uh, a safety in the qualifications that counselors have. And that's not to say that all counselors are safe individuals, or counselors are perfect
mhm,
by any means. That a lot of times I say counselors are like preachers. There's good, bad, and ugly out there. That there's
mhm,
amazing pastors out there,
mhm,
and there are those that are scary, and
mhm,
how they teach and what they do, or and
mhm,
spiritually abusive and destructive. And counselors are like that as
mhm,
well. That there are those who are really good and healthy and helpful, and there are those that are, frankly scary, and can be harmful and destructive to folks. And so, but being able to get a recommendation or referral to a counselor that someone can vouch for, that they've had a good experience for, that has reviews that suggest that they're a healthier counselor to connect with, can allow you to connect with somebody kind of outside of your normal circles and help you do some reality testing and share a little bit about, here's what I'm experiencing, here's kind of what I'm thinking, here's what's going on. Is this up? Is it down? Is it black? Is it white? Is it help me sort through what it is that I'm experiencing, so that I've got someone outside of my own head and outside of my own circles to begin to get my bearings about myself, about what is healthy and not healthy. But so I hear you, Tish, kind of in that, and the need to be able to process kind of outside of oneself, which could mean starting with a counseling relationship, but you might have in your life either a pastor or a mentor or a family friend or somebody who you do know is safe, right? That maybe you aren't in the situation where nobody in your life fits that criteria, but you do have some individuals that feel good, feel safe, would respond in a healthy way. And then they become a real resource for you to then process this relationship with this other individual that's not safe. They become a person that you can engage and kind of talk through what you're experiencing, that can provide some feedback and be a sounding board for you to kind of determine whether or not there's something that you're missing or a blind spot of yours that maybe you're not considering, and maybe set up some engagement of that relationship again to try coming at it a different angle and see if that's changes the response or changes the dynamic that's there.
Yeah.
What if that doesn't get anywhere, Tish? Like, what if you're kind of do that, where they're working with a counselor or a mentor or a trusted spiritual leader, or and they've kind of helped us reflect and evaluate and be intentional about approaching the relationship again, and it just is the same kind of disastrous thing that it was before? Then what?
Yeah, I think as far as just very practically, a mark of a healthy relationship, and the only chance a relationship has to, like, the ship to turn from unhealthy to healthy, is where needs are being explicitly expressed, where what you need and what you want. And I know that you touched on kind of healthy relationship boundaries a little bit last time, but I would say that, as far as how to navigate a relationship, that maybe before it hasn't, part of the process of trying to turn the ship before it hasn't worked, would be that component being very present of, this is what I need. This is how I experience that. And when they don't have a good response, you say that your response, it feels hurtful to me. It's hard to talk to you. It's hard to bring these things to you because I feel like you're not hearing me, or however it is that you feel. And so if you've done these things, right, which, as a side note, it's super hard, because when you go to the system that says that's black and you say, no, guys, it's white, they say, no, it's not, it's black. And then that can create this, like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe it is black and maybe I wasn't. And it can cause, it can cause us to collapse on the inside. And so maybe it's like, okay, well, when I have this emotional response, it creates this reaction from them. So the problem must be my emotional response. Or I'm experiencing this need. It doesn't feel good to me when this relationship expects me to do this. That doesn't feel good to me. But when I tell them that, they tell me I'm being selfish. And so, okay, I'm going to try to be less selfish and be more. And so that's why we really need safe people with us to help us, that plumb line, that kind of standard of what is healthy. So if that's been your journey and that hasn't worked, you ask the question of how long do you stay? How long do you toil? How long do you try? And, this is a really individual journey. and really our limitations as far as what we can absorb in a relationship, and in a way that, like, pain or trial or difficulty and suffering, like how long we can toil and keep trying to invite them in, I would say is different for each person. And in different situations, that the commitment to do that looks very different. In a covenant relationship where we've stood before God and man and covenanted, right? That's a very different situation than with family of origin or with a longtime friend. And so there's definitely no cookie cutter time frame by any means. And that a big part of it is, what are you able to do in a way that you can absorb? We're limited. We only have so much gas. And I think that can be really hard to accept. Like, I should be able to have more endurance and more perseverance. I've had this conversation, 20 times, but I should be able to have it 100 more times because that's how much I love them.
Mm.
And so I think that gets complex inside of ourselves because of our limitations tell us we want to endure through it all. But our limitations are telling us, actually, this is eroding me inside. This is becoming overwhelming. My emotional health is deteriorating. I have anxiety. I'm so stressed out. I don't feel safe.
Totally.
And so,
totally. And, I would say that, sometimes we can be paralyzed by fear of doing the wrong thing. That we can be paralyzed to inaction. And I would just want to speak grace to those that kind of find yourself in that space. That it is normal. It is the norm to do this poorly when you first start trying to do this.
Yeah.
Like, nobody becomes boundary experts or well-versed at how to navigate and change the dynamics of their relationships the first time that they try. It didn't happen. All of us kind of struggle and stumble our way through that in trying to figure out and learn how to do that. Some of us have it easier if we happen to grow up with parents that modeled it really well, and we know what healthy relationship looks like and what it doesn't look like, and we know how to confront that, and we know how to navigate it. And if that's your story, you're blessed to inherit that legacy and to have that inheritance from your family of origin. You should thank them continuously, because that's a huge asset and benefit going into life. But a lot of us didn't have that. A lot of us didn't have that experience of really having an example, that plumb line from our family of origin, to help us be able to navigate those situations. And so we're trying to figure it out, on our own. Yes. And we're going to mess that up. You're going to be in a ditch. You're going to be either distancing from people in relationship prematurely, when there probably was some time that you could have continued to strive with that relationship some and seen it turn direction. And then there's going to be other situations where you strive too long and it just grinds at you and depletes you in a way that's not helpful and maybe destructive to you in some ways. That the idea that you're going to time that perfectly, if there is such a thing as a perfect time to do that, right. Is impossible. So have some grace with yourself. Recognize that it's, whenever you engage that, it's going to be messy and it's going to be imperfect, and it's rarely terminal. You can always course correct. You can always correct a bad decision with a new decision. Generally speaking, relationship, obviously there's exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, making a bad decision, let's say I create distance in a relationship and I go, this feels overwhelming to me. I keep trying and engaging and it just feels destructive every time I engage it. I'm going to choose to step back from this relationship. And I'm going to say, hey, this relationship isn't working for me. And when I try to engage it, it's hurtful. When I try to share that it's hurtful, it's more hurtful. It doesn't feel like I matter to you, or what I'm trying to share with you matters to you. And so I'm just not going to continue to put myself in this situation, this dynamic. We do not have to be in relationship with every human being on the planet. In fact, it's impossible. It's impossible to be in relationship with every single human being on the planet, which by default then means that there's a limited number of people that you can be in relationship. You know, and researchers have tried to put numbers on how many relationships we can have at different levels of intimacy within our life, which is a whole nother kind of subject. The variety of kinds of relationships and friendships and levels of intimacy that are in relationship, and being able to invite people out of your dirty bathroom and onto the front porch of your house because they're not safe to be in that kind of vulnerable space with you. But the reality is that it's okay to be selective about who you're in relationship with. Can't be in a relationship with everybody. It's not a good idea to be in a relationship with everybody. And it's okay to choose whom you're going to have in relationship with. But there's really not a biblically defined, ordained by God scope of you must have these people in your life. Doesn't matter whether they're family of origin or extended family or faith community that you grew up in, or people you went to high school with, or people you've been friends with since college. Like, there isn't a defined relational dynamic that says you're not allowed to distance yourself from this person because of the kind of relationship that they are. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. And so it's okay to be able to go, even if it's painful, even if it's hard, even if it's a family of origin, even if it's a long-standing relationship, to go, this is not working. That it's destructive, it's breaking me down instead of building me up in a way that's helpful. And at least at this point in time, I'm not in a place to continue like this. And maybe I never will be but I'm going to have to step back from that relationship. And let's say we do that prematurely, right? One of the questions is the timing. How long do we go with this, right? Let's say we cut that off or distance ourselves from that relationship too soon. There's nothing that says that we can't re-engage a relationship. There's nothing that says that we can't circle back around and go, maybe I distance this too quickly. Now that I've had some space, I've had some healing, I've developed some other healthy relationships in my life, maybe I'm in a place to reach back out or move towards this person and see if they're even interested in re-engaging a relationship. We can course correct that. And if we've strived with it too long, and that at any point in time, we can decide, okay, this has probably been too long already, and it's time to take some action to create some distance in this relationship. And so it's okay to be imperfect in that relationship. You don't have to get it all figured out exactly how and when to do this perfectly before you decide to try to navigate those things.
Yes, that's such a good word, because I think that's the why we feel so paralyzed with fear. And I think what you're saying, this kind of truth about relationships, that repair is really important and it's necessary. And so the natural course of all relationships we feel that are close, we feel connected, there's rupture. As long as we're human and they're human, there's rupture. And that happens on a spectrum, different kind of everyday things in marriage versus big life events in relationships, and to repair to a deeper connection or a greater resiliency in the relationship. And so if that isn't something that you've experienced in your life, then your body's not going to have memory of that. So when you're in the situation of, if I walk away, it's obviously going to be forever, because you haven't experienced I'm sorry's growing up, or you haven't experienced that natural rhythm of rupture, repair. And so when there is rupture, it can feel like this is going to be terminal if I don't do it just right. and that what is necessary for any relationship to be maintainable long term is that repair is possible, and that requires both people, obviously. But I think what you're saying is that you know, to reach back out and to say, hey, I'm sorry, you know, as in retrospect, I handled this wrong, or to be able to say, you know, I need to step back, and that that is just so important.
Yeah. One last question that's come in that we're going to wrap up with here, and it's related to this whole vein, was just about, you know, what does rebuke in love look like, kind of within relationship and as it pertains to these things. You know, and I think a lot of what you have heard already from Tish and I kind of relate to this in terms of the language and the tone and the heart by which we, you know, I would recommend that you approach conversations like this. But I think it's one key thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to convince the other person of the validity of the action that you feel like you need to take. Like sometimes we feel like we need the other person to agree with us that this is necessary or part of the action. And a lot of times that's just not going to be the case. And we don't really need that. That as we're engaging it, we're communicating, one, how we experience the situation, right? That if I feel kind of hurt by Tish relationship, and I feel like we've gone through all the processes that we've talked through, and it's at a place that I need to create distance in the relationship, you know, I'm going to have a conversation that says, listen, Tish, I feel like we've strived in this, we've wrestled with this, I've tried to commit it every which way. I know I don't feel like you're able to hear me. I don't feel like you're able to respect kind of how I'm experiencing you in this relationship. And I can't continue to have this the way that we have. So I'm going to take space and distance myself in the relationship. I'm not going to engage you in relationship at this time. Maybe that'll change some point, but right now, that's just the way it's going to have to be. And I'm letting you know that. I'm not asking your permission if I can do that or not. I'm letting you know this is a decision that I've made and I'm going to do within that. And I'm communicating respectfully, I'm communicating humbly, and I'm, you know, encouraging the person to consider whether or not there's some things they need to take a look at here, right? I'm not the Holy Spirit. I don't bring conviction. I don't lead into truth. I don't see things perfectly as he does. I have all of my own bias and lenses and everything else that distorts my perspective. And so I'm, rather than banging a gavel in judgment, like I'm the Holy Spirit and I am omniscient and know all things, instead, I'm sharing how I experience the situation in the relationship. I'm communicating the action that I'm taking because I can't control the other person. All I can do is control me. It's in God's given me autonomy over is my life. I can make decisions to create distance. And I'm inviting, encouraging, telling the other person that I think that they should take a look at these things. I think they should prayerfully consider whether or not the things that I'm experiencing and feeling have validity and represent things that they need to take a look at in their life. I'm inviting them to go back to the Holy Spirit with those things and wrestle with them things themselves, right? That you can't make anybody see anything, right? There's this fun little Dale Carnegie phrase out of his books that a man convinced against his will is of the same mind still, right? Like it doesn't matter what kind of debate skills you have that you're gonna like convince this person and show them that they're wrong here. Forget about it. Yeah, man convinced against his will is of the same mind still. You're never going to convince anybody of those things. If that's something that the Holy Spirit has to bring about in the heart and the life of the individual. So you're just turning them back to that. You're not trying to play God in their life. You're sharing how you experience it. You're sharing the choices that you're going to make that are yours to make in response to what you're experiencing. And you're inviting them to go back to the scriptures, go back to the people in their life that they trust to provide feedback to them around things, and to allow the Holy Spirit to kind of deal with their heart if there are things that need to be dealt with there. And if they can't do that, won't do that, or don't feel like they need to do that, then it's just really clear indication that you're making the right choice in distancing in the relationship and disconnecting the relationship. Curious what you would add to that, Tish, as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, how to rebuke in love. I see, everything you're sharing is so good, Josh. And I think that rebuke is different than exhorting, and it's different than speaking the truth in love. And we're called to do all of those things. And so I see rebuke as kind of like a final step. That first I'm coming at it very, this is how I'm experiencing this. Like, where are you at with this? And maybe they're like, oh yes, I've just been stuck. I need help, and there's humility in response, and there is an openness to have that conversation. Or exhorting of, hey, I really see this in you and this moment. I really see this, leadership in you. I really see people look up to you, but in this moment, kind of everyone was looking to you, and kind of how you said that, this is how that struck me. And I'm wondering about that. And so then I think rebuking is like a stronger moment where it feels like something, and maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, Josh, and you can tell me what you think, but there's this sense of almost like protection for the person and protection for others. And that when there's resistance or when there's pride and the person is hurting themselves and they are hurting what matters to them, right? Or they're hurting the people around them, where you're just like, with ache and pleading in your heart, like, don't do this. And it's almost like coming at it, like I see that as like coming at it with pleading, like, don't. And kind of like throwing your body in front of them, and saying, don't go in this direction because it's going to hurt you and it's destroying what you care about. And so when I hear like the word rebuke, that's kind of what is called to my mind. And so to know that there's probably several steps before, unless you're in a place of authority, and this is our children and it is up to us to tell them what is right or wrong. But if it's not that unique circumstance, that there's probably a long or a decent process before we get to the point of rebuking.
Absolutely. Love it. Thank you for that addition on that, Tish. Hey, I've had a blast hanging out with you.
Yes, me too.
Great questions from those who have tuned in and those that have sent in messages. Want to invite you to send in your questions. You can do so at MyCounselor.Online /ask and use the asking for a friend form there to submit questions, and we'll get to them in a future MyCounselorLIVE event where we kind of talk through and speak to those things. You can also tweet those into us at Love My Counselor. It's our handle for MyCounselor.Online there. You can leave comments in the video description below. If you're watching this kind of after the live event and you're kind of watching the video after the fact, feel free to add your questions still at that point, and we will address them and talk through them in a future MyCounselorLIVE event, which will be back on the same time, 2:00 Central on next Wednesday, and kind of continuing to answer and engage your questions. So thanks for joining, Tish. Thanks for joining. Had a blast. Yes. And until next time, remember that we're cheering you on.